Okay, well, it's with enormous pleasure that I can introduce today Professor ElenaSemino. I think we've known one another for a very long time.
We have. Hello.
And Elena's going to be talking to me about the use of corpora in her work. So, what type of areas do you work on?
Okay, I started off. Okay, I'll pretend that you don't know. I started off working in what is known as stylistics, which is a linguistic analysis of literary texts.
Okay.
And I started off with poetry, but then I spent quite a lot of time looking at novels of various kinds, so prose fiction. And then my interest developed, I suppose, into what you would call discourse analysis. So I've looked at the use of language in politics, especially Italian politics, because that's where I come from. And I've looked at language use in science and in other genres. And generally speaking, when I've looked at non-literary texts, I've tended to look at the use of metaphor, because over time I became interested in metaphor as an important phenomenon.
Well, I know we're going to come back to metaphor, aren't we? So, with your work, say, in Italian, you're using these methods across languages, both English and in
English and Italian, yes. Okay. Yes, they're the only languages I work with.
And the methods work well across both languages?
Yes, you need, depending on what you are trying to do, if you need corpora that you might want to use as reference for a particular data set that you have, English is kind of the ideal language to work with at the moment, because there are so many different corpora, and you can take your pick in terms of what reference corpus to use. With Italian, things are catching up, and other languages, things are catching up. But generally speaking, yes, the methods work across languages,
So what attracted you in the first instance to working with corpora? Because I would guess that's not where you started from.
No, and even now, although I'm being interviewed today, I don't regard myself as a corpus linguist.
You're a linguist who uses corpora.
That's right, yes, some of the time. I guess I've been at Lancaster a long time, and at Lancaster it's difficult to get away from corpus linguistics. If I put it in a more positive way, it was useful for me to come across corpus linguistics early on in my career. And I started using corpus methods when I realized that there were some things that I wanted to show, or some claims that were being made in the work that I was doing, not just by myself, that really needed to be tested and, if possible, confirmed by some large-scale analysis of data.
So something other than your intuition?
Yes. And I suppose before corpora, you could have tested some intuitions, but it would have taken a lifetime.
That's a long time.
Yeah. So that's how I came to use corpus methods.
I suppose for certain texts with high cultural value where they've done concordances, things like Shakespeare, you could have done it in the sort of pre-computer age.
Yes.
Yeah. But otherwise,
but for
it's a lot of reading.
Yes, and sometimes, I suppose there are two things. Sometimes in some of my work in stylistics, what you're interested in is what is distinctive about a particular literary text. Okay. So a particular, for example, I've worked on novels that have protagonists that are interpreted as having autism.
Oh, is this the curious case of the dog in the night?
The curious incident of the dog in the night,
okay.
Yes. Yeah. So for example, that novel is generally interpreted in such a way that the narrator, who's called Christopher, he's 15, has an autistic spectrum disorder. People describe him as having Asperger's syndrome. It's interesting because in the novel the words autism and Asperger never occur, but that's how it's interpreted. And so what interested me was what is distinctive about the language used in that novel, which is written by an author who is neurotypical, if you like, who doesn't have autism. What is distinctive about it that accounts for the fact that so many people perceive it as a realistic representation of a mind that has a particular disorder? I'm not saying that it's medically accurate, but the perception of it is the same. So then you're interested in what is distinctive about that text, and being able to compare it with some other relevant, larger data set enables you to put your claims about distinctiveness, the distinctiveness of that text on a firmer empirical footing. It's not the only thing you do, but it's one of the things that you do.
So how did you establish your hypothesis? Did you, I imagine you read the book,
many times, yes.
Came away with an idea of what you thought it might be, and then tried to find out by contrast with other sources whether or not your hunches were right, or did the contrast actually give you insights that you hadn't actually got from reading the book?
A bit of both. So I have spent a lot of time with the novel. I don't tend to start with the corpus analysis, although one could, but I had done work with my students, by myself, on the novel, working on particular extracts. And some of the phenomena, some of the things I want to show don't lend themselves to being tested by corpus methods. But some things do. So for example, I had a feeling that the narrator uses the first person singular pronoun I very frequently. But then, you know, how frequent is very frequent is first person narration. So I then compared the novel. I did a keyword analysis. I looked at what words are used unusually frequently in the novel as compared to a larger data set, in order to see whether my hunch about I was right. You need to choose your reference corpus carefully, because yes, you can compare it with the general corpus of written English, but this is fiction. You can compare it with the corpus of fiction, and it works. Indeed, I and me turn out to be highly overused. But then I'm still subject to the objection, yes, but this is first-person narrations, of course. But luckily, we also have a first-person narration corpus, which we built up as part of a bigger project, an earlier project that we might talk about. So even when you compare the novel with a corpus of first-person fiction, I is one of the top 3 keywords. So then you say, right, okay, then I have some evidence that indeed the narrator is very self-focused, and you can then begin to link it to other. You can't interpret a linguistic feature on its own as meaning X, but then you see it in combination.
Okay, that's very interesting.
But there were other things I wasn't expecting. So the word because was very frequent. I hadn't noticed that, and then it led me to look for other things. And then I looked at words that were underused, that the narrator uses infrequently. And for example, those include we, the first person plural pronoun, which also kind of made sense because he's very focused on himself and he doesn't have a strong feeling of commonality with it.
Interpersonal is suppressed. So
So there are some other things, interesting things to do with you. So in a nutshell, what I found was what I always find, that you have some hunches, you try to test them with the corpus. Generally speaking, some of your hunches are confirmed, some of your hunches are questioned, and you get some insights that you wouldn't have got otherwise.
Great.
And that's good enough for me.
Now, you mentioned another project there. I think it's probably the one that we worked on together some years ago, on the representation of speech and thought in writing. One of the readings on the course is actually taken from the book you wrote with Mick. Coming out of that project. So maybe tell our viewers a little bit more about that.
Yes. Okay, I think this was my first corpus linguistic and corpus-based work, and it was with Mick Short, who I think had the original idea. So there was basically people will know about speech presentation in narrative. Narrators can use direct speech, indirect speech, and other forms to introduce the speech. And
so something like, he said, go to the shops.
That's right, that kind of thing, and you can do the same thing with thought.
He asked me to go to the shops.
That's right, the contrast, and then you can do the same thing with thoughts. You can imagine that the narrator tells you the thoughts of characters, and there's even, narrators can also represent writing. But basically what we started off with was a model of speech and thought presentation in narrative fiction, which had been developed at Lancaster by Mick Short and Jeff Leach in a book called Silent Fiction.
A long time ago.
A long time ago, first edition 1981. And basically that work and other similar work in that area made claims about which forms of speech or thought presentation might be more natural, more frequent, etc. But there was no study, there was no study that looked at frequency. So we then decided, and it was Mick's original idea, and we worked together, and then other people joined us. We decided to build a corpus of narrative texts. And we had fiction, biography and autobiography, and news reports. And basically we wanted to test some of the claims about, we had about 5 forms of speech presentation, 5 forms of thought presentation, and we wanted to see how frequent they were in different genres, what shapes they took. Now, although corpus methods are very clever, there is no way of searching look for direct speech. Even just looking for quote marks doesn't work. But certainly for indirect speech and other forms, you can't just look for them.
So there are so many ways of doing it.
That's right. So you can't concordance, you can't say, look for this and I find all the instances.
Or if you do, you get a bag of instances, but not all.
You don't get all. So we did something that is very time consuming but was worthwhile, which was to annotate, to tag our data. So it was manual work, inserting within angle brackets the information that we wanted in the text. It involved a lot of teamwork in order to agree on definitions, etc. It made us refine all our definitions because we had to tag all the data, so it led us to insights.
Okay, so this is where you develop an analytical scheme, apply it to the data, and in my experience it's clearly yours also, no analytical scheme survives contact with the data and you have to refine the analytical scheme.
That's right.
And then finally you can apply it to the data.
And that's what we did. We ended up with a slightly revised framework that applied better to the data. And then we tagged the whole corpus, which was very small by corpus standards, so it was 250,000 words, but for that kind of manual annotation it was big enough. And then we ended up with an annotated corpus that we could then interrogate in all sorts of ways. So for example, some things we might have expected, so direct speech is the most frequent form of speech presentation. This is something that has been claimed, we've got evidence for it. It is the case. But we also have a distinction between, say, popular fiction and more highbrow fiction, and direct speech tends to be more frequent in the popular fiction. If you compare the popular press with the more highbrow press, same thing, direct speech is more frequent. So you can begin to see things that you might have expected, not expected, etc. And we have a lot, people can read our results, we have a lot of results that went well beyond our original hypotheses. We have additional insights.
Well, there is a reading for the course taken from the chapter that you did with me, so people now understand that very well. Metaphor. That's something else that you've worked on using Corpora, and something I think you're quite well known for now. Maybe just describe what metaphor is and then your work on it.
Okay, so I've said that I started working on literature, so because of that I had to come to terms with figurative language right from the beginning. But when I was doing my work on literature early in my career, I came across the theory of metaphor that has been for the last 30 years the kind of dominant paradigm, which is cognitive or conceptual metaphor theory.
So metaphors are a type of figurative language. Figurative language would also cover similes, where you're saying you are like how.
And it covers hyperboles and irony, etc. So metaphor is a type. They're all kind of, these fuzzy boundaries between them all. But so in essence, what was claimed within this theory by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson to American scholars initially was that metaphors are more frequent in language than we expect. As soon as you get frequent, you begin to think that maybe corpus methods might be random. So they made the claim, metaphors are more frequent than we think. A lot of the words that we conventionally use are actually metaphorical, in the sense that we talk about one thing in terms of another, on the basis of some kind of perception of a similarity, a correlation, or something. So we say things like, I'm at a crossroads in my life, I need a new sense of direction, I need to get around the problem. So we tend to talk about aspects of our lives in terms of movement in space. And I could go on and on, but people can read about these things. There is this claim that there are conventional metaphorical expressions in language, and they form kind of families, so journey metaphors, war metaphors, etc. And then the claim was also made that the presence of these patterns in language tells us something about how we think. It tells us something about thought, and in particular that we may habitually think about certain things in terms of the different areas of experience. So this idea of things being frequent, things being conventional, etc., was initially proposed using sort of entirely armchair methods, in essence.
Which are very bad at actually reflecting on frequency.
Yes, I think these things can sometimes be, just to sort of be positive, right? These things can be useful when you're pioneering something, You sort of put something forward and you say, right, I've had these intuitions, they're based on these examples. They didn't say the examples are invented, but they kind of were, or at least they were drawn from experience, but not actually naturally occurring as such. And it was useful at the beginning to sort of get things going.
I agree completely. It's often how I approach studies myself. intuition is important in corpus linguistics. You have a hunch about something, you think something, you reflect on language, but then you go to the corpus for evidence and also to challenge your intuition.
That's right.
Would you agree with that position?
Absolutely, yes. And so what then happened, and it wasn't just me, but Alice Diamond at Leeds in particular, started working on using corpus methods to test the claims made in this theory, which by then had become very, very dominant, very popular, and also to push the theory to see how far it could account for linguistic patterns. And in a nutshell, what these corpus analyses tend to find is that yes, there is evidence that there are many conventional metaphorical expressions that we use quite habitually, and that generally speaking there is some linguistic support for the possibility that these patterns may tell us something about how we think, conventional ways of thinking, that technically are called conceptual metaphors. However, minimally some conceptual metaphors, some of these claims about thought, were formulated in a way for which there is no proper empirical evidence when you look at the language. You need to reformulate them, minimally. Some of the claims are questioned, and in some of my work I've shown how that is the case, and Alice Diamond has shown that. You then find other patterns that we hadn't thought about.
So some patterns confirmed, some patterns amended, some patterns you never imagined.
And some other questions, because the theory, some of the things, language has a funny way of behaving, and some of it is entirely unpredictable, or at least hard to explain. And certainly some of the patterns we find using corpus methods can't quite be accounted for by the theory as it is. And so then you need to develop a new... So it's kind of going back and forth between the data and the theory.
So that's the theoretical background and the sort of theoretical contribution your work is making, but you're doing some quite applied work on the back of that at the moment, aren't you?
Yes, so we, together with colleagues here at Lancaster, we're doing a project on metaphor in end-of-life care.
Who's funded that?
The ESRC, Economic and Social Research Council, yes. So that project is looking, we're looking at a very sensitive area in terms of communication and life experience. We're looking at end-of-life.
Oh, right.
So we're looking at a situation where somebody has a terminal illness and has been, is regarded as being sort of dying, close to death. That is an area where communication is often difficult, sensitive, emotional. But also essential. Absolutely, yes. And basically in that area there are concepts such as death, emotions, etc., which are often talked about metaphorically. And there's also
things like war metaphors, things like fighting.
Yeah, so that's the controversial one. I can tell you a little bit about that. But basically, yes. So, for example, a lot of people die of cancer. A lot of end of life is about cancer, although that's not the only disease where the end of life period is an issue. But everybody knows that you read in newspapers so and so died after a long battle with cancer, right? That metaphor is very prominent, it's conventional, it's been criticized by a lot of people, and it has been deliberately removed from policy documents produced in the UK on end-of-life care and cancer. Okay, it's been replaced with another metaphor to do with pathways and the cancer journey.
So is that because of linguists talking about it and problematizing the metaphor, or were there other reasons?
I would like to think that. Okay. I'll tell you what what provisional conclusions we're arriving at. I don't think it was linguists to begin with. Susan Sontag in the States wrote some influential books in the 70s and 80s criticizing all metaphors to do with cancer and illness. And her idea was, we need to get rid of metaphor, okay? Just get rid of the metaphors and we'll be fine. And now people are saying, even oncologists are saying, well, no. Well, first of all, I think as a linguist, I can say you can't get rid of metaphors. We use them all the time. You need to think about the metaphors you use, their consequence, the consequences, their implications, etc. So we wanted to take three groups of people: health professionals dealing with end of life, patients nearing the end of life, and unpaid family carers, so people who look after a relative, husband, wife, mother, father, etc., who is nearing the end of life. Because those are the three groups that need to interact in this very fraught time. And we collected two types of data for each group. We had interviews, and we have interviews we have enough data that one could analyze manually if one wanted to. But then we wanted to see what these people do when they talk, or rather write, as freely as possible in online fora. And online fora now are very important for health communication. Some of them are, obviously there are ethical issues, so all our data is anonymized, but we're only using data that is in the public domain, so only if it's not password protected. Okay. One of the things you find immediately is that carers and patients in particular talk very differently if they're posting online than if they're being interviewed. It's not surprising. But anyway, so there we have a lot of data. 500,000 words per group, etc., etc. There's a lot of data. So we then use corpus methods to look at the metaphors they use. But the corpus analysis is always informed by an initial manual analysis of the data. So you need to know your data.
Yeah.
We create a sample, we analyze that, going through it the traditional way, word by word, getting the team to agree on what we regard as metaphorical, and then we analyze the rest of the data.
Is it a cyclical process then? You sort of start with some data and your intuitions, you develop theory or hypotheses, and then you expose that to the larger data set. Do you then go back and do close reading of some more data just to check whether the big picture is actually applicable across lots of the smaller samples you could?
Yes, you have to do that, and in particular, if you're looking at online fora, you need to bear in mind that there are some individuals who post a lot, and in almost every one of our data sets, we got one or two people that we call by name, because they post a lot and they latch on to particular metaphors and use them. So you need to be careful that you're not generalizing and actually it's two individuals who are skewing the data. In terms of method, what we're doing is, again, we're pushing things a bit by using corpus methods. Okay, one of the things you could do, we know that battle is used in relation to cancer, let's look for the word battle. And you can do that. You concordance it, you find lots of examples, that's great.
Sort of drill down into the data that one way.
And you find things around it and it's all very good. The thing is, yes, it's fine, but with concordances, you find what you're looking for. Okay, that's okay. So what we're also doing, we're exploiting a bit of software that was created here at Lancaster by Paul Rayson, that has, we're using a semantic annotation tool, which in a nutshell allows us, rather than just looking for words like battle, fight or war, we can ask the software, give me all the words that are to do with warfare. Okay? In that case, the words are, the individual lexical items are not determined by my search. I'm just looking for those words. Now, if I was looking for those words in a set of articles about the war in Iraq, they would mostly be used literally. But if my data is what I told you, then most of the words are used metaphorically.
With that software then, say for example if you're looking, a different example, but you're looking for the word bank, does it distinguish between the meanings of bank? So if you're looking at the broad, what we might call semantic field, broad general area of meaning of financial institution, it will only show you the examples of bank that match that rather than say location like river bank or something.
It has a sequence. Each lexical item has more than one semantic field associated with it, and one will be the first one. So it will be put under that one, at least as far as I understand it. But we also have a way of doing, which we developed as a consequence of the metaphor work, which we call broad sweep searching. So I can either, and this gets a bit more technical, if I say to the software, find me all the warfare expressions, it will look at the words that have warfare, which is the G3 semantic domain, if you want to know, that have it as their first tag. Okay, they have a series of tags, but that's the main one according to the lexicon, if you like, in the software. But we've also created, Paul has created a way of searching that says, look for the words that have G3, the warfare domain, anywhere in the sequence of tags. And that's useful for us because, for metaphor analysis, because some meanings, some metaphorical meanings are very conventional, sometimes, inevitably, they're included in the lexicon, and so the software gives us the metaphorical meaning as the first meaning, but we still, so for something like a tag, the software puts it under communication, because one can attack somebody else's opinion. But what we're interested in is actually attack comes initially from physical struggle. Okay, so we have two ways of using that software. And by doing that, and this is very preliminary, so this is actually findings that we are sort of arriving at now. Okay,
so you've done all of that. What do you find?
Right. So let's take these war metaphors because we have worked on them. People are keen to find out about them. Okay, they have been removed from policy documents, and as a sort of discourse analyst and metaphor scholar, I would say, yeah, it's probably a good idea. If you're writing a policy document for a lot of people, given that thinking of your experience of illness as a battle can be negative for people, you've got an enemy, sometimes the patient can be the battleground, etc. If you don't get better, you lose, etc. So there are good reasons for saying, let's not put them in the policy documents. But then you also get, within the medical world, the claim they should be removed altogether. And the thing is, we find, as always, it's not as simple as that. So, first of all, even those battle metaphors can be used by patients in particular as empowering metaphors.
Okay.
And we find it with even people who are older.
Some agency in the
yes.
process. Yeah.
I want to beat it, I want to fight it, etc. There are moments, at least, when those metaphors are empowering. And that's what... So, a doctor, a health professional needs to be sensitive to what metaphors are these patients using, and are they using them in a way that seems to work for them, that makes them feel good at this point, in which case, fine, we shouldn't sort of remove them. Or are they using a metaphor that in fact they're using it, but it actually suggests that it's bothering them, the way they're understanding things that way. So we found, first of all, that they can be used in a positive way. Not always, but they can.
Okay.
We also found that, in fact, there isn't, as sometimes, especially in the medical literature, there's a reference to the military metaphor for cancer, for example. There isn't just one, there are many. And the corpus work showed us that. So you have the fight that the patient fights trying to get better, you have the the war that the researchers fight looking for a cure, you have the doctors fighting on behalf of the patients. But we also found that we didn't expect a lot of people who talk about themselves as fighting, but the professionals are not giving them the weapons.
Right.
And that is one way of talking about...
So they're the arms manufacturers.
Yes, it's talking about the fact that sometimes the best cure is not available or not found. But then these patients actually talk about, we're sort of beginning to see there are lots of things that they perceive as battles around them. So they talk about going to hospital as a siege or something. They talk about well-meaning relatives invading their space. They talk about preparing for going to see consultants as I need to prepare my ammunition,
right,
etc. So actually we're realizing there are lots of battles that these patients feel they're fighting, and so you get a sense of kind of the emotional state, and sometimes what the metaphors reveal is problems that need to be dealt with, so that the patients don't feel that way.
So there's a sort of the battle metaphor, so to speak, is sort of pervasive, multifaceted, and protean to some extent. It keeps on changing its shape around.
Yeah,
that's absolutely fascinating.
And it gives you an idea, but I can go on forever. But we also found that sometimes, especially in online fora, people use these metaphors humorously.
Right.
Because we must remember, and I found it doing other work on health communication, that even when the situation is very negative, when people feel that they're communicating with people who are like them, they feel that there's space for jokes. Okay, so there's one whole set of people in our forum who talk about each other in terms of military hierarchy, captain, brigadier, etc. And it's a funny way of referring to each other that gives them some power, because the medical people sometimes talk about, if they use the war metaphors, they talk about patients as their soldiers, the soldiers dying. But the patients sometimes use the kind of military hierarchy to present themselves more as being in charge, but also to tease each other.
Yeah.
But we did find one metaphor, and it's the last thing I'm going to tell you about this. We did find, so in essence what this shows is that no metaphor is inherently good or bad, it depends on how it's used. And censorship may be appropriate in some cases, if you're writing a policy document, fair enough. But other than that, you need to be sensitive to what the patients are doing with the metaphors. And if they're using them in a way that helps them, use them as well and help them, right? So, what I tend to say is different metaphors work for different people, and even for the same person, different metaphors may work better or worse at different times. The one that we haven't been able to find some positive use of is time bomb. So one of the things that we found when we looked for give me warfare in this data is time bomb, which may not even be a warfare metaphor, but it came up, right? I'm a time bomb, I'm a walking time bomb, my cancer is a time bomb. The idea that you've had cancer, it's been treated for now, but it may come back as a time bomb. We wonder whether it's been picked up from professionals, we don't know, but several patients describe themselves that way. We haven't been able to think of anyone or find any evidence that this could ever be a good way of talking and thinking about yourself. And even with the bomb metaphor, if in the bomb domain, if the bomb explodes, that's it. But actually, if cancer returns, there are all these things you can do. So at the moment, if you ask me, are there any metaphors that you really think should not be used and patients should be encouraged not to think of themselves? That would be the one. That would be the one.
Well, thanks very much, Elena. We'll make sure that we give URLs for the semantic tagging system. People can find out more about that, and also for your metaphor project.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd be delighted, and if people are interested, get in touch.
Well, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.